Thanks for joining us. So I'm Sara Mazzotta, community member here in Grandview Heights. We are really looking forward to this conversation. I think you can see if you take a look at the bios that have been posted, we have a fantastic set of panelists here. We could have made an event, a separate event for each panelist and fill that with great content, but we intentionally wanted to bring this panel together because we want this conversation to be about community. We want to understand the challenges, the strengths, and the rebuilding of Black communities in both Tulsa and Columbus. So I think there's a lot of learning that we can do together. When the task force got together for this year of racial justice learning, and we decided we wanted to know more about the Tulsa Race Massacre and the Centennial that was coming up. And we really had two guiding principles. We wanted to hear the Tulsa voice and the Tulsa perspective, but we also wanted to tie it into our community conversation. And what does that mean for us as a community in Columbus, very close proximity to a community that you hear about tonight, the King-Lincoln Bronzeville District. And it's through that conversation that we can learn from each other. So we wanted to have that community conversation. And tonight we'll structure it in a way that we look at the past, the present, and the future, sort of toggling back and forth between Tulsa and Columbus. So thank you again for making space for this conversation. And I know that we have a lot of Grandview Heights represented here in their schools and also community members and parents. And we want to take this conversation. We know that there's personal work to do in this space, but we want to do this work together as a community. But I also recognize in the audience that we have folks from Athens and Cleveland and the broader Columbus and Tulsa area. And we believe that we can learn together from everyone's collective experience. So thank you for making time for this. So what I'd like to do before we go into that past, present, future, let's get to know our panelists a little bit more. And here, I think it's important for the context of this conversation to hear a little bit about their background, where they're from, and their current work that they're involved in right now. So let me turn it over first to Jerica Wortham, if you'd introduce yourself to the audience.
Hello, my name is Jerica Wortham. The work that I've done recently in Tulsa was a project director for the Greenwood Art Project, which was a project designated to tell the story of the 1921 Race Massacre and explore the past, present, and future of Tulsa in the Greenwood District through art. And so we did this through a public art installation, which consisted of over 30 different public art installations. And beyond that, I am a wife and a mother and a poet. Tulsa stand up. Yes, Caroline.
Thank you. And Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Good evening, everybody. Phil Armstrong. I'm currently the interim director of the Greenwood Rising Black Wall Street History Center here in Tulsa, a $20 million facility that citizens of Tulsa, community concerned citizens, and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission raised funds for the unveiling of this historic place that tells the history in its full narrative, history that people do not know and are just being awakened to. So much beyond the massacre and the horrific event of 1921, that Tulsa, Oklahoma, in fact, the state of Oklahoma, at that time, the territory of Oklahoma, was a respite, a paradise for Black citizens from around the country to escape the post-racial experiences of 1865 and beyond, and found their fame, their fortune, and life under their own terms here in Oklahoma with the creation of the All Black Town movement. We tell that full history, that full narrative, the destruction of Greenwood, the rebuilding of Greenwood, its second destruction because of urban renewal, which Columbus is known for, and we all have a tie-in, and then its future. I am originally from Ohio. I was born and raised in a small rural farm town called Bidwell, Ohio, which is about an hour and a half southeast of Columbus. And I attended Central State University, historically Black college there in Xenia, Ohio. And that's where I actually learned and was taught about the history of Greenwood back in 1991. So Ohio roots, but now planted in Tulsa. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks. Caroline.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is CarolineINSPIRES Bennett, born and raised in North Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74106 to be exact, North Cheyenne Avenue to be a little bit more specific. I am a product of Emerson Elementary School. I went to Carver Middle School. I was Miss Carver. I went to the Booker T. Washington High School. I was Miss Hornet. And then I went to college in Norman, and then I moved up here to Columbus, Ohio. But nonetheless, I am born and raised in North Tulsa, Oklahoma. Proud of where I come from. And I say North Tulsa. Some people just be like Tulsa. And for those people, you know, they are from Tulsa. But as for me, in minds, when I say North Tulsa, growing up, North had a negative connotation. Growing up, North was always on the news for doing something bad. North was on the news for something, everything outside of the positive things that exist. And so what I started to do as I grew up, I said, okay, so they like me, but they don't like North Tulsa. Okay, so let me just let everybody know I'm from North Tulsa. So then you have to like North Tulsa. If you like me, you can't like me and not like North Tulsa. There we go there. So nonetheless, I moved up here to Columbus, Ohio to go to grad school. I am a first generation, 2-time loan and debt-free graduate of higher education. And I moved up here because Ohio State was giving me a free ride. And so I came to Columbus, Ohio. I am an artist. I am a speaker. I am a community organizer. I am a youth advocate, a mentor, a business owner, and I stayed in Columbus, Ohio. Tulsa got one part of me. Columbus, Ohio has the other part of me. Columbus has developed me, developed this artist side of me. Tulsa developed the strength side of me, right? And so to be an artist, you need strength and all of these things. And so I'm now here being a speaker, an artist. Tulsa is my home. Columbus is my home, but Tulsa my home. North Tulsa my home. And I'm extremely grateful, excited to be on this panel. Thank you to Miss Suzan Bradford for asking me. We'll get into all this stuff a little later on about all that good stuff. But yeah, I'm excited to be here, y'all.
Thanks, Caroline. I think you can see in the first 10 minutes the Columbus and Tulsa connection here. So Suzan, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure. I'm getting feedback. Hold on. Let me get this off. I'm doing too many things here. Let's say now, is that better? Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay, good. So I'm Suzan Bradford, Kunta, and I am the executive director of the Lincoln Theater. What a proud gem we have in our city. I am a born and raised, a product of Columbus, Ohio, and of Longstreet, of which the Lincoln Theater sits on. Just a proud citizen of Columbus, Ohio. I have my roots here, and everything that I know, do, and learn is that of a catalyst from my mother. I have to give her that shout out always. It's just been my journey. Where I'm sitting at now is just a destination on my journey of being the executive director at the Lincoln Theater. The Lincoln is in its 93rd year of being existing, and originally opened in 1928. And I was just really blessed and favored to take the renovation, the new opening, the renovation, and move it to its space now. We're in 12 years in. We have a number of signature programs there, really about the artist development, but also keeping the nostalgia of the Lincoln Theater and moving it through with these innovative opportunities and thought. So again, it is my pleasure to be here to talk about the Lincoln Theater. You'll find that I love her so much. And that the relevance and its purpose for standing is that just as it is for Tulsa and the Greenwood area. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So before we transition talking about that past, present, and future, I do want to encourage you all to put questions in the chat. We are collecting those. If we can integrate them into the conversation, we will, but we have a lot to talk about over the next 45 minutes. But at the end, the next 30 minutes will be a Q&A session. So be thinking of your questions, look for those themes we're talking about. We want this to be a conversation about how communities can grow together. So to anchor our conversation in the past, we do want to touch on specifically the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So I want to turn it over to Phil, if you can help give context to that history part, and then any other elements of Tulsa in the past that you want to surface for the conversation.
Sure, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I know that Jerica and I have been in the trenches now doing this work and bringing Tulsa to the forefront in many different facets and different ways, facing this tough history. You have to understand there are people still to this day that grew up in North Tulsa, grew up in South Tulsa, grew up in Oklahoma City, grew up in Oklahoma, period, attended public schools, and never, ever was taught or heard anything about this horrific event, the worst case of what we refer to today as domestic terrorism, but the worst race riot that ever occurred on American soil. The only community that can say that Americans literally took private planes and dropped bombs on their own fellow American citizens and wiped out and destroyed a community of Black citizens, a 33 to 35 city block area called Greenwood. And thanks to the production values of HBO, Watchmen, and Damon Lindelof, and the work that he had done with the unveiling of this history on a worldwide scale with Watchmen, and then with Lovecraft, this became a worldwide phenomenon and the phenomenon being, how in the world could this have happened and no one really know about it? And it really comes down to people who were and are passionate about history and go beyond what it says in the books, because you can know this is not in the books, and people that if you were taught this, you had a very passionate teacher, whether a Black or white teacher, that really wanted you to know about history. But the overwhelming amount of citizens that even today, the Centennial Commission started this work back in 2015. But even today, the commission has completed its projects with sunset in June. But I still get emails from people that will say, Black and white, that will say, do you know that I was in college outside of Oklahoma, whether it be University of Texas in Austin or Berkeley or an East Coast school. And they'll say, I was taking a history class. And it's amazing, whether Black or white, they say the same things. I'm taking a history class just to get an elective out of the way. And this professor starts talking about this Tulsa race riot and showing pictures and showing, the destruction, the devastation, the mayhem, the murder. And I'm sitting there and they say the same things. I was first shocked. I was embarrassed because other students in the class are turning to me and saying, hey, aren't you from Oklahoma? What's up with this? And they have to sit there and say, I have no idea what this is. And then they say, I got angry. Why would I have to be an adult? Why would I have to leave Oklahoma to learn about something like this? So it's the massacre event that really shocks and brings you in. But then it's the rich, vibrant history that I think we'll get into more tonight, of just what African-American communities were. Greenwood was not a phenomenon. The only thing that made Greenwood stand out is the dual power of ownership, that Black citizens, they owned their land. They were able to own land. And the fact that this was the birthplace of the oil and gas explosion in Oklahoma. And so if you owned land, and number one, you had power and wealth, but then you own that land, and that land then started producing oil. Whites and Blacks became millionaires overnight. So that was the magic behind how Greenwood became the most affluent African-American neighborhood ever to be seen at that magnitude anywhere, and even since then. But our shared histories, there are communities all over the country historically Longview, Texas, Elaine, Arkansas, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York. The list goes on and on. Columbus, Ohio, as you know, the history behind Lincoln Theater, where Black communities, because of segregation, because of Jim Crow laws, they had to become insular economies and they had to depend on themselves. So they actually became very prosperous. Black citizens couldn't go downtown and get a loan from the bank. They couldn't go to the grocery store on the white side of town. So they became extremely self-sufficient communities because of segregation. And this was all over the country. But again, Greenwood, how this place became a magnificent magnet. They literally had a Black town movement. They would send newspapers around the country and they would tell Black people, basically, get to Oklahoma. We own land here. We own businesses here. We have our own destiny. We can live our lives free from persecution. By 1883, there were over 30 all Black towns prospering. The term Black Wall Street, the Black Wall Street that was started here, actually was ascribed from Booker T. Washington and his first visit to Oklahoma in 1905. Word was all over the country. You know, Black people are really living amazing lives in Oklahoma. Booker T. Washington wanted to see it for himself. Greenwood didn't get its real start. Its first business didn't start under O.W. Gurley until 1906. So Booker T. Washington came in 1905. What did he see? Greenwood hadn't started. He saw all these historic Black towns. He went to Breadbud and Taft and Langston, where now Langston University is. He went to Muskogee and Ocmulgee, and the list goes on and on and on. And it is reported that he made the remark, this is like living in Negro Wall Street. And he's the first to coin that phrase. And then that in the 60s and 70s returned to Black Wall Street. But that's where that comes from. That's where Greenwood gets the moniker of the original Black Wall Street. But on May 30th, 1921, the building of racial animosity, the land run of 1889 welcomed Blacks and whites from all over the country. But the sad part is the overwhelming number of whites from the South and Southern communities that came to Oklahoma and brought that Southern racial climate, that mentality with them. So as they started making claims and standing up and looking around the community and seeing Black people living and prospering and Native Americans, they immediately began to change what they thought needed to be changed. They brought the South with them. And that land run of 1889 led to Oklahoma becoming a state in 1907. And the first act of the first law in the state of Oklahoma, December 15th, 1907, was the first law book, the first book put on the law. We're now a state. What's the most important thing we should make as our first law? We'll make Jim Crow our first law. And I tell people psychologically, could you imagine what a slap in the face that was for Black citizens who 30, 40, 50, 60 years have been living just fine and living prosperous lives alongside white people living, doing their thing, Native Americans doing their thing, but Black citizens being allowed to live among themselves and pursue their own life. And then we become a state. And many people have actually remarked, it's funny, but it's really true. The worst thing that happened to Blacks and Native Americans in Oklahoma is when Oklahoma became a state. Jim Crow became the law of the day. So all of a sudden you're Black and you can't go certain places. You legally can't do certain things. Now, all of a sudden the mindset and the legalism of the state changes that you have found to be a place of prosperity for you and your family. And that racial animosity built and built and built and built until you get to 1921, the elevator incident. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old Black boy, he's shining shoes as a shoe shine boy downtown Tulsa. The only place for Black citizens to relieve themselves, to go to the restroom, colored restrooms. The only place was the Drexler building downtown Tulsa. It's on the 3rd floor. He goes to the restroom. He gets back on the elevator. On the elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl by the name of Sarah Page. As the elevator is going down, something happens. The elevator shifts. He loses his balance. In order to catch himself from falling, he suddenly grabs her arm as he's falling. She screams. The elevator rests on the 1st floor. The gates open and he takes off running. A merchant from across the street in Renberg's grocery store comes to her aid. He hears her scream. He sees a Black man run away. And by that afternoon, what was reported in the paper. Again, the racial animosity was at a point where all people needed was something to really get things to just explode. And what caused that was the front page reporting of the Tulsa Tribune, a front page article that said, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." That sparked, if you were a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan had a heavy presence in Oklahoma from 1919 to 1929, the largest increase in the membership of the Klan occurred in the state of Oklahoma. 10 years of the greatest increase in that terrorist organization occurred right here in Oklahoma. And right while that's building up, you have this pinnacle of Black wealth, success, and excellence in Greenwood, and it's right downtown. And so they can see it in their own eyes every day. Black citizens driving nicer cars, Black citizens living in nicer homes, Black citizens living life to the fullest. And it was an affront to white supremacy. It was an affront to the thought that they're supposed to be living beneath us. And it was building that animosity. And all they needed was a reason. And that reason was that Nab Negro. And that Nab Negro for attacking girl. And that article went on to give a false, salacious report. It said, and I'm paraphrasing, Black boy Dick Rowland scratches her face, tears her clothes. Her screams were heard by the merchants across this way. At the end, it said, Sarah Page is a young orphan that's trying to pay her way through business school by working this elevator. All of that were false. She was living with her parents. She was not going to, so she wasn't an orphan. She was not going to business school, but it was a way to paint that this young, innocent girl was attacked by this Black man. And so the dog whistle was this: 1921, a Black man has just tried to rape a white girl downtown Tulsa in the middle of the day. What are you going to do about it? That was the impetus that they needed. And that report came out at 4:00 in the afternoon of the next day. Dick Rowland is arrested, brought to the courthouse. A mob begins to form. Rumblings of a lynching is possibly going to take place. By that evening, Black citizens of Greenwood heard what was going to possibly take place. And about 36 Black men who had served in World War I came back in 1919. They were unafraid. They still had their guns and munitions. They actually marched downtown to protect Dick Rowland, not to try to start a fight. They surrounded the courthouse so that he could have his just day in court. You're not going to have a lynching on our watch. That animosity built and built. The mob grew to about 1,500, and about 10:30, as it's reported, a white man by the last name of McQueen goes up to one of the soldiers. His last name was his name was Johnny Cole, and that white man tried to take his gun away from him. In the struggle over that gun, the gun discharges at 10:30 p.m. And as many eyewitness accounts report, all hell breaks loose. The fighting begins there. The Black soldiers retreat back to Greenwood. And over the next hour and a half, the Tulsa Police Department, and these are all recorded eyewitness accounts from Blacks and whites that to this day are held by the Oklahoma Historical Society. So it's not conjecture, it's not rumor, it's not what we think. It's actually reports that were eyewitness accounts. But over the next hour and a half, the Tulsa Police Department deputizes many of the members of the mob. They're given guns, they're given ammunition. Some of them break into pawn shops and steal guns and ammunition. And about 1:30 a.m. on June the 1st, that mob grows to about 2,000, and they make their way and march into Greenwood. They made their way at the intersection of Archer and Elgin, and they began 16 to 18 hours of looting, burning, destruction, murder, and mayhem on the Black citizens of Greenwood. And that is what we referred to as the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, which in 2018, we held a press conference and changed how we referred to that because it was labeled a riot. Because it was labeled a riot, Black citizens could not get their remuneration and their insurance claims honored. No one was ever brought to justice. Anyone, even white citizens that wanted to bring to the court people that they knew, officers that they knew, members of the Oklahoma National Guard that they knew were a part of this, that were complicit. They dismissed all cases. They dismissed all accounts. No one to this day has ever been brought to justice for what took place in an entire community. $2.7 million of destruction in 1921 dollars. The value of money over time, it's been estimated anywhere from $30 to $50 million of destruction in today's time. Those are still conservative estimates. And to this day, no one has been held accountable for that. And that is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre in a nutshell, as quickly as I can give it to you at that point.
Thanks, Phil. I'd like to hear from Caroline and Jerica growing up in Tulsa. Can you give some context of put this event in, did you hear about it or not? And what's it like, some of the historic context from your perspective?
From my perspective, we did not hear about it often. Basically not at all. The first interaction that I had with the history of the 1921 Race Massacre was my junior year in high school. And that was a result of the senior class ahead of me having their senior prom and inviting one of the citizens, one of the survivors of the Race Massacre, to the prom. As another piece of the history is that this all happened the night of Booker T. Washington's senior prom. And so there are senior high school students getting dressed, getting ready for prom, not being afforded that opportunity, that moment that they look forward to all year long, that cherry on top of their school year outside of graduation. And so the senior class of the class of 2000 wanted to host one of the survivors for their senior prom. And so that was my first introduction to it. But even that was sort of in passing, and I understood, but I didn't really understand the magnitude of all that happened. In my mind, it was, oh, we're inviting this nice old lady to prom because she didn't get to go to her senior prom. I didn't understand it was because of all that had happened. Outside of that, in college, I had the opportunity to attend the Big 12 Conference of Black Student Government. And I think it was the one in Kansas. And we had a sister duo, born and raised also in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Crystal and Nicole Carter. And they did a presentation on the 1921 Race Massacre. And so when I'm looking through the programs for potential workshops to attend, I see a workshop about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I'm like, what Tulsa Race Massacre? I'm there, born and raised. Like, what do you mean? What are you going to tell me about my city? Because at this point, I'm not even recognizing the name. So I'm kind of going to do a little fact checking on what's happening, college, get a bit precocious. And so I went to this workshop, and the images, the stories, that was my first real interaction. And so as a result, Tulsa has just been in a space of silence as it's related to the Tulsa Race Massacre. For many years, you did not want to talk about it as it could literally cost you your life. You then have to compound that with the trauma associated with this situation, with people losing their husbands, their wives, their mothers, their fathers, their children. There are stories of women literally giving birth in the middle of the street. And so you have to recognize that this is not necessarily something that you want to discuss at the dinner table, right? You may get like a piece here and a piece there. Oh, we used to go and visit this space before, and then it's just kind of goes off into the distance with the dots. But it wasn't anything that we really discussed. And so even now, as we begin to unfold and unpack it, you see maybe some of the reasons why people were apprehensive to even begin having these discussions, but you also understand why it's absolutely necessary to do so.
And I just want to pause on that a little bit, though, that you said apprehensive. Can you give a little bit more information of why do you think folks are apprehensive to talk about it now?
There's a lot of mixed history. One, there is no statute of limitations for murder. Second of all, no one really wants to identify potentially with a trauma that has occurred. I mean, one, you have to either identify yourself as like a this or a that, right? You have to either identify yourself as a survivor or a descendant thereof, or you have to identify yourself as a member of the mob that created this horrific event. And so it's not necessarily anything that anyone wants to uncover. Then you compound that with the discussions of reparations, with the discussions of land allotment, and what are we doing with the space? Is Greenwood becoming gentrified? Do we see enough people that look like us in this space that once was completely occupied by people, well, not completely occupied. There were Native Americans, there were white citizens there, but predominantly it was occupied by people of color. You see 40 city blocks reduced down to a single block on either side of the road. And so to begin that discussion, you have to be willing to unfold and uncover all of that. And then, as Phil mentioned earlier, no one has ever been held accountable, not the city, not any individuals that may have caused any of these murders. We're just beginning to even do the unfolding of the mass graves. And it's just so many elements that are involved with this, and no one really wants to necessarily implicate themselves in the process of unfolding that and answering to citizens who are concerned about tax dollars and who are concerned about all the things outside of honoring those that went before and honoring the businesses, and beyond the businesses, just the humans that were here and that occupied the space. And so it's a lot.
Hey, Sarah, if I may chime in, and Jerica so eloquently put that in terms of the apprehensiveness. I also want to add just to that, if I can, also, so you've got trauma, historic racial trauma that impacted obviously Black citizens, but there's racial trauma for all of white Tulsans and Black Tulsans, because here's what, we faced the pushback on what the Centennial Commission was trying to do in 2015, just to say, hey, 100 years is coming up. We should be doing something as a community to commemorate this. We were, 6 years away, and we need to be doing some things. Black citizens, you have a portion of those that will never get over this. Individuals who are in their 80s and 90s, and some in their 100s, that will always be, there's almost a post-traumatic stress disorder, if you will. They will never, they live in North Tulsa, and to this day, it's 2021. And there's still, I know older Black citizens that still are, you don't trust white people. I don't go to South Tulsa. I don't go down there unless I have to. And they still have that. And they pass that on to their children and to their grandchildren. And their great-grandchildren, that mindset of what was done to them, then they never forgot. You have that aspect. You have Black citizens who are, promises made, promises broken. Every few years, someone comes along and they say they're going to do something, but nothing ever happens. And all this development happens on the other side of the city, in South Tulsa, East Tulsa, West Tulsa. Everything new goes there, but you see nothing but a desolate place where we live, and people come here when they want to get elected, and we never see them again. So there's this despondence from Black citizens, like, we're tired of going through this. Plus the fact that they actually had an Oklahoma State Commission back from 1997 to 2001, and it was a state-funded commission. The Oklahoma State taxpayer dollars go out. Republicans, Democrats, rich, poor, come together, do a commission, take 5 years and study this, and come back to the state with recommendations of what we should do to recognize what took place. One of those was economic empowerment zone to revitalize Black Wall Street in Greenwood. One was educational scholarships for students to go to school for free that had been impacted by this and were descendants of this. Cash reparations to those back in the 1997, there were over 20 survivors still living. Cash reparations. This was a commission that said these are the things that should happen. And here in 2021, 20 years later, not even one of those recommendations have ever been enacted upon. So you have, then you flip to the white citizens who you have, okay, why, you try to blame me for what happened 100 years ago. What are you guys trying to do? And I don't know if I believe in reparations. So you have all of these real and valid emotions, but this fear of what are you guys going to do? And what does this have to do with me? And just trying to explain people, no, we're not blaming people now for what happened then, but we're all stewards. We're stewards of the systems and the governments and the governmental agencies that have been handed down to us. And so therefore we're in positions to make policies and make changes and to rectify the wrongs that were done that no one else has addressed. And bringing people to that, it is a very, as Jerica can be a witness to, it is a fiercely contested, continual push to get people to understand why it is so important for us to still address this.
And I'd say to that, I'll go ahead and give my insight. Growing up in North Tulsa, yeah, you weren't taught about it. And as a student, as a matter of fact, I was kicked out of class, to be exact, kicked out of class, and was told that I was intimidating the teacher because I had questions, because Oklahoma, it goes without saying, we know where Oklahoma stands in the education system. They've been there for a long time. So I'm just going to leave it at that. So when I was in high school about 10 years, this was just about 10 years ago, I was a sophomore in high school. And you get to one chapter and so funny. The cool part about it is that this was actually an Oklahoma history class. And there's one chapter in the book. Like, can you all see the space between that's where the one paragraph fits. Everybody can see that? That's not how many pages. I'm not talking about this way. That's the number of pages. This is about the length. So that's 1, 2, 3. That's like maybe 10 sentences that were in the book that we were assigned. This entire Oklahoma, it don't matter if it was a U.S. history book, you had to take government every year, a history every year. And every year that paragraph remained the exact same. It was this big. And so as a sophomore in high school, I remember saying, okay, I feel froggy. I want to ask questions. Are we going to talk about this? Teacher ignored me. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to figure out a way, because I'm always figure out a way to talk about what I want to talk about. And we need to talk about this because we're sitting in this class. And if the book ain't going to talk about it, surely you're going to talk about it because you're the teacher, right? Surely, right? We in Oklahoma, surely this is Booker T, Washington High School, right? Sat there, ignored me one day, ignored me a second day, ignored me a third day. Then it got to the point where the ignoring started being reports made to the deans that I'm being disruptive, reports made to the dean that I'm asking too many questions, when actually I never asked. There got to a point where she literally didn't answer any of my questions. So how can I ask too many if you never call on me? Seems pretty odd. Nonetheless, it never happened. We never talked about it. I was literally banned to be removed from the class. The chapel told me, if you continue on, that's what she said. If you continue on, she can have you permanently. And I was talking big stuff. I was like, and then I'll have my mama come up here. But the reality is, why am I being put out of class for asking about something that you all should be teaching us? It should be embedded in the curriculum, but it wasn't. They didn't teach it. They didn't teach it. A lot of teachers didn't teach it for all of the reasons that Phil and Jerica talked about. But then also people didn't teach it because they don't think it's important. You also have a lot of people who don't think that what happened in Tulsa, not just the massacre, but the success of Black humans is not important. And they don't want to teach it. That's also hard for people to acknowledge, is that we as a Black people were, are, and can be that successful. So that was tough, because you learn it on your own in high school, and then you get older and it's like, hey, y'all really gypped us of an education. And not just because we're from Tulsa, not just because we're from the state of Oklahoma, but I work with high school, elementary, middle school students now who still have no clue of what happened in America. We are ripping these kids off. These teachers who go to college, who want to be teachers, history teachers, who are not required to learn what is happening, we are ripping them off from their education. And so it sucks. It sucks. Now it don't suck because you begin to find the truth on your own. You begin to understand that you are also the living truth, right? And so then the pain begins to lessen a little bit. But as a child, nah, that's kind of painful when somebody's like, it's still people up here in Columbus, to be exact, people in Ohio, they'll meet me. Oh, you from you know anything about the Gap Band? Do you know anything? And I'm like, yes. Do you? Like, this isn't new to us, to those of us who, well, it is new to some people, but to some of us, a lot of us, this stuff ain't new. And so it's like a slap in the face when it's like, oh, you just found out? Okay. Well, thanks for the reminder. Just when I thought we had made a step forward, thank you. And it seems like the only time we talk about Tulsa and what happened in Tulsa now is when we come up on this centennial, because we celebrate the hundreds and the tens and the 25s and the 50s. But what happens when next year is year 101 and 102? Will all the hype still be there when it comes to talking about what happened in Tulsa and what is currently happening in Tulsa? Because it wasn't talked about 10 years ago, and that's not that long. 10 years is a whole decade. That's not that long ago. People are uncomfortable with talking about the trauma, but people are also uncomfortable with talking about the successes of Black people.
And may I add just another piece to that? That is part of the importance of us keeping this conversation going. When I think about the students of today, the youth of today, and when they walk through North Tulsa, when they walk through their community, and while there is some gentrification going on, you see the bike lanes going in, you know what that means. You see some of the buildings going up and the facades changing, but in a large part, if you're still going home to your home in North Tulsa, you're still going into a desolate space. And so part of learning this history is to also allow children, students, youth, adults to connect with this history and to understand and connect to the excellence, to understand that this wasn't what it always looked like. This reality that you see today is not always what the reality was for this space. There was excellence in this space. There was businesses, there were entrepreneurs, there were people that were allowed to dream and dream fully and to think and to create resources for their community. There were people that were able to provide many options for their students, for their children, for their families. And so when you take that to today and you think of some of the youth that may not feel as though they have as many options, maybe if they understood where they come from, their posture has the ability to change. When you learn a history, when you learn that you come from something beautiful, when you come from something positive, when you come from $1 million, $1 billion legacies, potentially, then your posture changes. You begin to think of yourself in a different way. You begin to conduct yourself in a different way. You begin to see your community in a different way. You don't see it as a space that you run away from. You see it as a space that you can help to grow and to cultivate and to hopefully come back to and to continue to build legacies within that space. And so, but you can't just jump there. You have to talk about the history. You have to explore that this was once a beautiful space. You have to understand that there was a destruction that occurred. And then you have to also understand what steps can we take to make it, to rebuild it? How can you be a part of the process? You have to have the full discussion.
So let's
Jerica and Ms. Bennett. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Phil. I was going to go ask Susan if she can talk about another beautiful space and bring in the Columbus and King-Lincoln Bronzeville District and the Lincoln Theater. So here are a lot of similarities and themes there. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of that district and the theater and the role in its community?
Sure, I can. And I'm just nodding my head with everything the other panelists are talking about. And what keeps coming back to mind for me is that, yes, we do have to acknowledge always the injustices of what happened to Tulsa and many other states around the United States and to Black people. And that too has to be told. But what I hear both Jerica and Caroline and Phil saying is that not just that story, but the story of the successes of Black people in spite of. And so the Lincoln Theater's history it's just parallel to what we're saying here. So 1928, not too far from removed from the Tulsa Massacre. But when we talk about those years of that success, and I did my research with the Dreamland Theater that was very similar to the Lincoln Theater, and where it's set and how important of its presence in that particular community, and how it was used as a catalyst for economic development, for housing, for education. So it makes these theaters more than a theater. It becomes that beacon of hope for a lot of people in those communities, and even the communities that come in. So just like we're saying, yes, the Lincoln area, King-Lincoln Bronzeville area, to be inclusive for all of that, was the $1 Million Mile. And as we're talking about the events that address segregation, as Phil said, the Lincoln is with 3 other theaters that was built by African Americans, by the Grand Union of the Odd Fellows, who said, hey, since we can't go downtown, we're gonna build our own theaters. And when they built those theaters, the businesses came, the practices came, the grocery stores, the cleaners, the restaurants, all of those things came with that. And that dollar just moved up and down Long Street from one end to the other, crossed over to our other street, Mount Vernon Avenue. And all those houses in between there, in the radius that sits around there, the dollar was going. So you could see that. You could see that. And I was fortunate enough to be born near that time, where I could actually be a part of that, the ending part of it. So I was able to, as a young girl, walk to school, both elementary, middle, and high school, in that rich community, and see and buy my ice cream from Black owners, and get my shoes shined from the best guy there, and see the artists there, Amina Robinson, Elijah Pierce, Koja Kamal, right there in my neighborhood that I could see them. And so for me, coming back around to tell the history takes it back. If we don't know that history, if we don't share that history with our kids, then we're lost. So we can say, well, what happened to those people of the $1 Million Mile in Columbus, Ohio? Where are they now? And if this information wasn't passed on, then it becomes lost. And we know that sometimes that is a thing that if we don't tell people about the richness of our history, then we don't have, then we can continue to devalue their presence and where they live. Now, here we are. Years later, the Lincoln closed in 1974. It sat for 30 years, dilapidated, run down, no life. And that happened because of urban development. So you come and you bring in a highway right through the middle of the $1 Million Mile. And it literally cuts off the artery to that vibrancy of that community. It cuts down all of those things. And so no money can come in and no money can come out. So then you have this mass exiting of folks in that community moving out to the other places, and leaving those beautiful mansions and homes, sitting there, businesses drying up, can't survive, trying to hold on to that. And then you get to a point where some of their generations, those children don't want to keep those houses. They move into their education. They don't have any connection to that. They have a different kind of dream. But if they knew the sacrifices and they knew how rich their parents were at that time, like you're saying, Jerica, it would have postured a different kind of attitude. And so here we are now in 2009, the building still set, went through a number of different owners that really couldn't put back the history of it. And our former mayor here in Columbus, the executive director of CAPA, which is one of the heads of our theaters here in Columbus, and one man that I just call the Godfather because he makes things happen here in Columbus. His name is Larry James. Came together, totally different avenues, but came together in their expertise to say, hey, the building structurally is not worth saving, but the history is. And that was really their journey and their goals, is to restore that history. I think as we begin to have this conversation about the Lincoln, I remember me and my mom driving by there several times. And I said one time, I wonder who's going to direct that building. Went to a few things, talked about some art, and then the offer was made to me to become the general manager at that time, hence moving into the executive directorship. But it's about the survival of that theater was about the nostalgicness, it's about the innovation, creating spaces of our own. Phil, you said that. We have created all these communities that address their and created their own equity, and created businesses and things that the community needed so it could stay there. Things recycle every 30 years or so, yeah. And here we are back with this mass gentrification happening all the way throughout our country. And it sits right there in Long Street, it does. The front of our building has not had access in the last 10 weeks because of gentrification. And so now my shows and my events that are happening there, again, we have to keep finding these alternative ways to stay alive, alternative ways to be recognized, alternative ways to be respected, alternative ways to keep our history in front of what we're doing. So just holding on to that success part of it and telling our young people, this is where you come from. This is the legacy that you hold. You know, who wants to come from or hear about the dark, desolate, bloody, dehumanized spaces of slavery? That's not where we came from, you know? And so those who exhibit that promise and that dream of our ancestors, we have a responsibility and a goal. We have a responsibility and a duty. So for me being at the Lincoln Theater, my goal is to introduce the history of that theater and then allow the artists who come through there the tools, resources, networking they can have to go ahead and push themselves into their own success, not the other measured successes of other people, but for their own success. And so we have quite a bit of artists who are doing that and networking. And so Columbus is being known as that place where artist development can happen and can be owned by these young people. They don't have to go to New York or LA or DC and become a starving artist. They can stay home and be supported, be fed, not just artistically, but you know, some real good food so that they can grow into the best artist and the best person they can be authentically in their Blackness. And when they walk around and see that, and they're beginning to, other organizations are beginning to bring them in, they're, you know, I say to them, contrary to what we think, when we sit at the table, they want us to say something. So it's our duty and our obligation to bring up the history, to talk about those hard conversations, and then to be able to get others to a point where it's not about a resolve, it's an acknowledgement, and what are you going to do better individually so we can be better as a whole?
Thank you. I think the panel has beautifully answered the importance of looking at our history, even though walking through trauma and painful anecdotes. The risk, if you don't, is lack of confidence, what I see in the chat, and really feeling lost, like Suzan mentioned. But the benefit of the strength, the resiliency, the beauty, you see arts emerge and all of these, this legacy of excellence. And that's why we wanted to take so much time today to walk through that history, and you can see those parallels there. So 100 years later, let's go back to present day and go back to Tulsa. And Phil and Jerica, can you talk a little bit about the Centennial events, but broader than that, present day, of what's making a difference, what excites you, why do the arts keep surfacing in that community as well? So Jerica, do you want to start, and then we'll turn over to Phil?
Well, thank you. Present day, we're still working to tell the story. The Centennial was, as you could imagine, absolutely jammed packed with activities. even with the Greenwood Art Project that I had the pleasure of being a part of, as we mentioned, 30 individual installations, 3 outdoor open air in galleries full of posters that were created by community members. We had a series of opportunities for the community as a whole to engage. And so we had students as young as 5, adults nearly in their 90s, creating posters, creating works of art that have been found and seen, one in these open air galleries in 3 historic spaces, one in historic Greenwood, one on the corner of Pine and Greenwood, and one at a location that we refer to as the Steps to Nowhere. And so, which is an area that was once occupied, destroyed, and due to policy changes and adjustments, they were not able to rebuild their homes and stay there. And so the steps just have remained, but it is no longer a space that is occupied. And so we put installations there. We have engaged light posts with flags. And so as community members drive down the street, they're able to see works of art created by other community members, maybe themselves, maybe their children. We've had plays and books written and musical presentations, poetic presentations. The arts have just been the way that people have been able to process this. It's been a way for people to engage in meaningful dialogue and to do it in a less intimidating fashion. The history, the content is still the same, but there's something about being able to, one, go to a neutral space, right? This isn't anyone's home. This is a space that people can engage with this history, and they can engage with it in a unique way, in a way that still leaves some room for interpretation, leaves some room to explore freely, leaves room for them to really just kind of digest and to experience another person's reality, or to share in the experiences of community members that they may not in and of themselves been able to resonate with. And so doing that through art, it just offers room for it to be done in a way of that is, it's just easier to digest. I don't know. I lost my train of thought. Phil, save me. Save me.
It's not saving you. I mean, the anybody who was here could see the work that Jerica was able to do, and it's really a testament to the collaboration of not only Tulsa citizens but people from around the country that have. There's one thing of having vision and having dream and having ideas that have power and can bring communities together. And then there's another thing of people who have the resources and can believe and say, you know what, I believe in that vision. I like the way you have crafted and put it together. Let me help you. The Greenwood Arts Project came out of the submission from the city of Tulsa to the Bloomberg Foundation for art programs. And, we were $1 million. That's what really got things started, was that $1 million grant. And actually, Mr. Bloomberg actually flew into Tulsa to present that I'm proud to be able to present this check so that, a project and projects of this time. And that's gave birth to the Greenwood Arts Project. But, it takes a community. It really takes a community of people to sit down, to understand this history and to understand how incredibly vibrant it is. And then you see the response, people saying, how can I get involved? Just a couple of highlights of what the commission was able to do in the community are probably one of our big highlights. It never really get a lot of attention, but we got a lot of response and applications. Was one of our big corporate sponsors here, WPX. They actually ended up being bought by a Devon Energy company, but they pledged $150,000 for us to be able to do what was called the Centennial Commemorative Grant. And we actually had people from all over the community that everybody wanted to do something. I want to sponsor a book reading. I want to write a play. I want to bring together the community for a sing along. I want to do art. People had all these great ideas, and always says, you know what, if you have an idea and you want to do something, as we're getting to this commemorative approach, you don't have to be, you can be a nonprofit, you can be an individual, apply for a grant and a grant process. And we actually gave out anywhere up to from $1,500 to $10,000 per grant. And we had to have 2 rounds of that. So we probably had over 80 grants awarded to community grassroots people that just said, I want to do a book reading on the race massacre and bring people together. All you had to report basically to do was to say, how will you commemorate and bring community citizens together? And you applied for a grant and we awarded those. That was probably a really big thing that brought people, that made this kind of like, this is a we thing, all of us together, and not just a quote unquote, a Black thing. That it really brought Tulsa citizens, white, Black, young and old, to say, okay, we're commemorating this together. Then, of course, Greenwood Rising, talked about that in the facility, but we also raised money for district boundary markers. That's the last project that we have yet to reveal. Those are actually being constructed now, and they'll be displayed here in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And there are 6 markers, because everyone comes here and they see this small strip of buildings and they think, is this all that Black Wall Street was? They have no concept of what does 35 to 40 blocks from the railroad tracks northward, a mile, and a mile between east and west. What does that look like, where everything was owned by Black citizens? And it's just incredible, 10 to 12,000 African Americans in this community. And so we're going to actually have these district boundary markers around places that when you come into Greenwood, you'll see this beautiful marker saying, now entering historic Greenwood District. So people can see just how incredibly large demographic this area was. Then we have the Pathway to Hope. The Pathway to Hope is this walking narrative path that we built with conjunction with the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. We debuted it as one of the Centennial projects. And literally, it's simply this narrative walking path with beautiful landscaping and trees and bench. But what it does, it allows for art to be displayed. And it's right along the border, right along the south wall of the I-244 highway that bifurcated Greenwood, that destroyed. It was built through the business district, as what you all experienced in Columbus. It was built right through the heart. And so the Pathway to Hope connects historic Greenwood Avenue to historic Elgin Avenue, and you can walk across and go right into the John Hope Franklin Park. But what it does, it's a symbol of rejoining the district that was destroyed by this highway. And when this was built, when this began in 1967, again, this is to highlight what was going on all over the country. This happened in Columbus, Ohio. This happened. I can remember as a kid going to Columbus and to see my mother's brother and sister live there. And to get to my uncle, you went through this place called Bexley. And I always wondered why I-70 all of a sudden took this great big curve all the way around this prosperous, beautiful, enamored, high net worth individuals, yet the highway went right through where Black citizens lived. It's the exact same thing here. And the crazy thing is, when they built the highway, there are no exits. There were no exits so you couldn't even support business. There was no exit into Greenwood. The exits were not, it's almost as if it was done intentionally, which, of course we know. And when people look back and say, well, how could people do this? How could this happen? I use that as an example when I go into schools and I go to colleges, universities, and even elementary schools and tell them this is the importance of having diverse voices sitting at the table, having people of color, having people from different backgrounds, because in the 60s, there was one demographic making these decisions, white males sitting and making this decision. And these highways always went through the path of least resistance. So if I am have constituents and I say, no, you're not going to build this highway through my community. That's where my folks live there. You're not going to build that there. There was no one sitting at the table to keep them. And so when a highway is coming through, put it over in the Black neighborhood. Yeah, build it right through Greenwood. Eminent domain, and many Black citizens call that period of urban renewal, they call it urban removal, because it happened to so many communities around the United States during that time period. In fact, we have a local African-American here who's one of the descendants. His name is Bobby Eaton Sr. We call him Papa E. And when you ask him, he'll call it Negro removal. He said, don't call it what it was. It was Negro removal because it happened all over the United States. But this history brought people to the awareness. Oh my gosh, man's inhumanity to man. What have we done? And so when you have a Lincoln Theater, when you have a Dreamland Theater, and you tell people, this was where Black people enjoyed life, and not only for Black citizens. The Lula Williams Dreamland Theater, it was boasted it was the largest theater in the state of Oklahoma. It boasted of having air conditioning, whatever air conditioning was in 1921 in that time period. But white citizens would come into Greenwood and go to the Dreamland Theater. It's just that Black citizens could not leave because of segregation and Crow, but white citizens regularly came in. They went to the doctors. They bought from the businesses there. The economy always allowed white citizens to come in. It's just that exchange never happened for the Black communities. When Mabel B. Little, she's a famous person that visited Greenwood back in 1913. She was 16 years old and she wrote a book. She wrote a memoir. At 16, she moved from New York City to Greenwood. And in 1913, one of her memoirs says, "The nighttime sky is lit up with all the theaters," theaters, plural, not just Lula Williams, but the theaters of Greenwood. It wasn't we cannot, as much as we have read and researched, I don't think anybody really can grasp how incredible a community, an entire neighborhood was dedicated to Black excellence, Black art, Black achievement, Black wealth. It's something that we can think about and maybe wrap our head around, but we really can't understand how incredible this was for places like Columbus and Longview and Greenwood, Oklahoma.
Thanks, Phil. And Suzan, I'm going to ask if you can talk about present day Columbus, Lincoln Theater, and then also transition us to the future as well. So if you can share a little bit about the things that are exciting you right now happening around the theater, and then also if you can share your hope for the future.
Sure, thank you. Wow, I kind of elude just the possibilities and the hope that I have for the Lincoln. But I do know this, as we're going through this world transition and this world unveiling, that arts is probably one of the best vehicles that we can use. We know that it plays an important role in the journey to social wellness and social justice. And so we've used that throughout pretty much all of our cultural history to send messages and to give hope and to give perseverance through our music and through art making, through dancing. And so the Lincoln has those 4 genres that we really work with our artists to use and to develop and to speak the voices of Black culture. And we know that with Black culture and Black lives, now it's very loud, it's very artful, and it's spreading throughout the world. And so people are now beginning to take hold on what that means, especially the young people who are saying, wait, questioning the ethics and questioning the conversations that they're having with their parents inside their houses. And then they go to school with children and people of color, and it's a different story. And so it's difficult to have those conversations, but they can also use art making to get to that point. So as we're growing at the Lincoln Theater, of course, we are the smallest theater in Columbus, but we're the most used theater in Columbus, Ohio. In 2018, we were open 333 days of the 365. So there's a lot of richness comes here. And then as Phil was saying, it's a pass through from downtown to Bexley, and when we were doing our study, we found out that 6 million people were passing through Long Street and the Lincoln at that time. And that helped us to talk about, the visibility and how do we make the Lincoln very attractive for the folks to come into the space. And so we have a very thriving, a very artistic community there in the Lincoln. We have other ones around the city, but I like to think and say that the King-Lincoln Bronzeville area is just full with Black art and Black culture and intentional. So we have a lot of young professionals moving back into their spaces and wanting to be that presence of culture and of Blackness, even though it's being gentrified. And so they're very present, they're very loud, and they're very intentional about being heard and about preservation inside of there. So they are taking advantage of a lot of opportunities around the city, that the city are understanding that they have to have culture, Black culture in the city for it to thrive, for it to grow, and that kind of thing. So yes, we get kind of turned away with the walking of dogs down the sidewalks and people running and bikes and all those kind of things, because we know that those are always signs of gentrification. But we still have to understand that development is inevitable, but also community is inevitable. And so as if the community who is there and the community who are being heard, that they continue to speak their voices of Black culture, why it's important in there. Some of the things that we're doing, we're now into our 12th year of the Lincoln. And it's a very commemorable benchmark, because we didn't have a measurement. We didn't have anything to measure the Lincoln to. And so for me to take that blank canvas and create what we have done at the Lincoln just speaks to our mission. And I know that whenever we do mission programs, and I'm developing programs that they're mission-based so that they can have some sustainability and they can serve the community. And so those are very successful programs. We are now, with COVID, we had many of the other theaters and places shut down. But I moved in a space about reimagining what we do well. And so that was the motivation, just to be as safe as we can be and still provide an outlet, an artistic outlet for folks who were comfortable. We did that. And what that did was put us really ahead of the 8 ball. And so as we are coming out of it and still being cautious as we have this resurgence, the Lincoln's availability is just overwhelming because we have these procedures in place. And so we're able to provide a lot of programming for folks. What's coming up is the National Urban League's Town Hall, the Central State University Board of Trustees reception, the Will Haygood launching of his book, Colorization, the Making of Black Films in White America, with Robert Townsend. We have a gospel festival coming up with the Central State University and Kentucky State University coming up. We have Bobby Floyd, who is probably just the most dynamic piano player and organ player in the world. He just retired as a piano player for the Count Basie Band. So we have a lot of rich history coming through there. We have a lot of very gifted and talented people who are there. We have Aaron Deal, whose family just lives across the street with their business, who frequents the Lincoln when he comes into the space. We've had Ledisi there. We have Wynton Marsalis there. So it's still living up to its rich history. We are into a huge campaign now to move and upgrade our branding and our identity and our purpose and our reason for legacy and longevity there. It takes work because we're considered a small nonprofit institution, but the reach and the impact we're making is priceless and just very valuable to the history of what we're doing. So I'm very excited about our history and our future, about what we're doing, how even with the city growing like it is, we have very good foundation and statistics and good stories to tell where that will support our funding efforts.
Thanks, Suzan. So I want to make sure that we're going to have a little bit of Q&A at the end. I know we're coming up on 8:30, but I also want to, there's so much happening now in the future that we're looking forward to, but I also want to provide some space for our artists to talk about their hopes as well. So I just want to turn it over to Caroline, if you can share a little bit more about your hope for the future.
Of course. I guess two hopes that come to mind. One is in reference to one of the statements that was actually placed in the comments in terms of the students being curious about why this isn't discussed in school. One of my biggest hopes is, I'm not saying adults are a lost cause, right? Because I'm an adult, but young people are that's where our hope lies. And so if we can't teach them because we do not know, then my hope is that we can at least point them in the right direction and make this kind of knowledge and this kind of information accessible to young people. And that's as simple as it gets, because they don't know. And what happens is that when our children don't know, they grow up to be adults who sit in Zoom calls, who do not know things. And they become adults who go to classes and try to teach other people the things that they do not know. And more lies get told, and the truth just gets stretched even more, or the truth doesn't even show up. And so my upfront hope is for young people to be exposed to education that tells both sides, in the words, gives a holistic view of what has happened specifically to here in America, gives a holistic view, not just this trauma, not just the joy, but gives a holistic view of everything that America is responsible for. That's one hope. And then more specifically to that of artists, conversations like these are amazing plays, and I love them. And I think they're great. Even beyond that, putting money and resources behind these things is the best way to go, right? Because we can teach the history, especially specifically to that of Black artists, to Black people, and we could teach our children. And yes, we'll walk away with this sense of confidence, which is great. But then I say it all the time, we in America, we have across the board, pole to pole, coast to coast, we have a real bad issue of confusing progress with movement. Right. And so what happens is we think because we have these conversations, we think because we do have some commemoration with a piece of cake that has a nice decorated thing by a local, cake designer or something, we think that, oh my gosh, we doing our thing. Like, this is it. We really over this history stuff. And it's a problem. And then we never actually do anything that's sustainable. It just feels good. Right. And so put money. Thank you, Taisha. Pay the artist, put money, and not money that's like leftover money. Make the money that you desire to pay artists, make it priority, because the arts is really what's saving all sides from breaking out in another war. The art is really what's keeping Black people, people of color in their right minds to not retaliate in ways that are not as fruitful for a nation, if I could just be frank, being completely honest. And so we should just invest as a priority, not as an afterthought, because it's important, it's necessary. And yeah, those are my hopes. Give the children the resources, teach them, or get out the way, and then put money behind and in front of artists, Black artists. Yeah, that's it. From Oklahoma to Ohio.
Thank you, Caroline. Jerica, your hopes.
My hopes are similar. I'll keep it brief. One, that we create a culture that, again, students feel comfortable coming back to. We've now gotten to a space where our students are going off to schools, they're going off to universities, but to create a community that they want to stay in and to help continue to grow and to build, because they see opportunities available for them, even if they are students of color, that they can still see themselves in CEO positions. They can still see themselves in executive positions. They can still see themselves being able to build a business and to build it successfully. And then definitely pay the artists, go team, go. And really, and pour money into these small businesses. There are people that, of course, they are capitalizing off of the story of Tulsa. They're capitalizing off of the trauma, the history. And so it's really also making sure that we are creating opportunities for small businesses, because there is still a very vibrant and thriving Black Wall Street in Tulsa. There are several small businesses, but creating opportunities for those businesses to continue to scale at the same rate that their counterparts scale, to provide those opportunities for them to have full funding without necessarily having to go through all of the vetting, like the classes, and they want you to go through like 5-year universities and 10,000 workshops in order to get funding, where counterparts are potentially getting funding and checks written from just from who they know. And so just really continuing to build a more equitable space that every citizen feels like they have the ability to thrive equally within that space.
Thank you. And Melanie, I know you've been tracking questions. I think a lot of them have been answered through the discussion, but is there anything we're missing for the panelists?
I don't know if Taisha has a question. Her hand went up. She could have got the Holy Ghost too, though. But she might also have a question.
Yeah, go for it. Do you have a question?
Thank you all for this conversation and for taking my question. I do, there was a statement made earlier that Greenwood was the only incident of a US bombing on a Black town, and I want to hold space for the MOVE organization of Philadelphia, which was also bombed by an arm of the US government. And I want to bring that up just to point out that that type of violence continued, right? That there are very specific targeted forms of violence that have happened to Black communities in our country. The overwhelming majority of residents in Greenwood during the massacre were day laborers, wage earners, and they were subject to a very direct, overt type of violence. And similarly in Columbus, our median household income is $25,000 in what is now called the King-Lincoln District, formerly Bronzeville, but it's subject to covert forms of violence, right? Redlining, redistricting, even the name change is a form of violence. So my question is directly to Jerica, to Phil, and to Suzan. What are your specific organizations doing to repair the violence that's being done to low income and mid-income residents in the area? We talk a lot about Black excellence and those who own properties, own businesses, et cetera, but they were not the overwhelming majority of the population. Speaking to Caroline's point earlier, right, about poverty and characteristics that are ascribed to that. So can you speak more to what your specific organizations are doing to repair the violence, either overt or covert, that's being done to low income and mid income residents in your community?
Well, I think that every organization has the part that they play, right? So everyone doesn't do everything. My organization is not a piece of civic, and so we're not creating legislature or not passing appropriations. We're not doing any of those things. What we are doing is using art as a way for citizens to express themselves, as a way for community members to address topics that are necessary to be discussed in order for us to begin to move this needle forward, to create the policies and the programming necessary to hold accountability where it is due. In addition to that, when we speak of providing resources for community members, providing resources for organizations, providing resources for artists and small business owners, through our project, we funded nearly $500,000 in grants to artists, to local entrepreneurs. This was money in the pockets of real people, not large organizations, not funneled through some nonprofit that it may or may not actually touch the pockets of a community member to do anything real and substantial with. We were helping to fund the dreams and to provide platforms and to provide opportunities for artists that are talented and worth national notoriety, but because they're in the middle of the US, they're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they did not necessarily have the opportunity to have that exposure that was necessary to create the opportunities to continue to build and grow and expand in their crafts nationally and internationally. So for our particular branch, for our particular piece of this pie, it was directly to the arts, and it was paying artists their worth, paying them what they were due, and allowing them the opportunities to tell the stories in the way that they needed to tell. And I will also add, in a way that the community specifically and expressly asked. We had community meetings where we asked community members what they found and what they would consider success to be at the end of this project. And we made sure that we hit every single one of those points, and every single point was hit. It was to honor the story. It was to tell it authentically. It was to allow space for real community members to tell this story their way and to be funded and paid their appropriate market values to do so. So that was our piece.
So
I'll chime in, Jerica. I think that was excellent. And to answer Ms. Taisha, first of all, point of clarity, Taisha, I was the one that mentioned about the bombing and one of the only communities that have been bombed. The line of demarcation is that the city of Tulsa and Greenwood was the only city to this day that private citizens put their private planes in the air, multiple planes, and dropped bombs. What happened in Philadelphia, as you correctly state, what happened also in Chicago, it happened in Chicago. Those were government entities that actually did those crimes. Was horrific. But not only in Greenville, the first time that it ever happened, but these were private. The Oklahoma National Guard participated in the later acts of supplying ammunition and actually pulling out a Gatling gun, and we have the witness of that. But the planes that flew over that dropped the incendiary devices, the kerosene bombs, those were multiple aircrafts owned by private white citizens that were dropped on their fellow Black citizens. So it still stands alone in that category. Now, what are the things that the Centennial Commission did, or I should say gave birth to? So the money that was raised and some of the efforts that we did, and I'll be quick. So as a result of that work, a group called Mortar, which is out of Cincinnati, Mortar, they are a group that actually goes into economically disadvantaged communities and help rebuild economic revitalization plans. They are boots on the ground. We raised money to bring them here. That's taking place, already underway. One of the events that we hosted here was the Economic Empowerment Day. It was a collection of some of the leading African-American security professionals around the country, the Michael Paynes of the world, the Ron Parkers of the world. It was hosted by Hill Harper, Eric Peterson, who lives in Columbus, Ohio, who's a VP of financial services, retirement financial services, for one of the major financial firms in Ohio, was one of the leaders of that. And they brought Black thought leaders, financial leaders from around the country to talk about Black wealth, to talk about investing in communities of color, not only in Greenwood, but around the country. It sparked that conversation and got the conversation going. We actually raised, afterwards, we raised $1.1 million from that. After expenses, we had $700,000 left over. We took $100,000 of that and we actually dedicated and donated to the 3 living survivors and then the Massacre Fund. And then the remaining $600,000 has been divided up between Rose Washington, who's a Black female that runs the Tulsa Economic Development Corporation. They will get a bulk of the funds. They will actually be providing low interest and sometimes no interest loans to Black business owners and first-time home buyers as we go through in the future. That's a major thing. And also, I'm going to drop in the chat the latest thing that was announced last week, the city of how you get the government finally moving along. The city of Tulsa announced the Kilpatrick Heights Greenwood Master Plan. All this work has led to bringing people to the table, we still haven't got the city of Tulsa to write direct checks to those, but what they did create and the oversight panel are all African Americans that live, work, and are proponents of North Tulsa. I think Councilor Vanessa Harper is a part of that, but that will bring in, and they've hired a master plan developer that will spend the next 18 months working directly with North Tulsa Black citizens on a master plan to revitalize Black homes, Black ownership homes, and Black businesses. And so those are some incredible things that are happening that will take place and directly impact direct Black descendants and descendants of Greenwood. So just happy that we were able to at least get some of those balls rolling and seeing that move forward into the future.
Well, thank you all. The time went really fast. We knew that it would, but it went faster than I even expect. I feel like one day we should have a part 2, maybe live at the Lincoln Theater. I think that would be awesome. But I appreciate, I deeply appreciate panelists, the generosity of time, your wisdom and insights. And really, this is just a starting of a conversation here so that then we can get together as a community and do something about it. So I challenge you all to really capture those thoughts and inspirations and what you need to do within your own personal work, but also what we can do together. I'm really inspired by the work that all the panelists are doing and the difference it's making, and that we really have a collective voice that can bring a lot of change. You know, I was reflecting on this passage this week that was talking about sometimes it feels like it's hard to balance, like we can't have sorrow and joy at the same time, but it's really often with this really great sorrow comes great joy from the same experience. And I know I'm feeling the tension of those feelings tonight, and I'm really inspired by you all. So thank you all for taking time for this conversation. It really means a lot to us, and we wish you well tonight. Thank you, everyone.